We are beginning today our study of the next chapter in the synthesis of yoga, titled The Planes of Our Existence, where Sri Aurobindo lays down the framework for the levels of consciousness which make for the cosmos, and describing this in the context of the relationship between the Purusha and Prakriti, consciousness or soul and nature. The chapter itself is fascinating because he leads you to the deeper understanding of why at all there are multiple planes of existence, planes of consciousness. What makes for the special feature of the physical world and the material plane generally, and its relationships with the other planes. And understanding that, we can understand what it is that makes us experience the sense of being bound or trapped in matter. And understanding that, we have the key for how the consciousness can be liberated from this entrapment and ascend the planes of consciousness until it finds its highest poise of freedom, while still engaging with the material world and working in the domain of matter. So it is a fascinating chapter, and in the next 2 or 3 that this whole discussion covers, Sri Aurobindo also gives us the broad framework to understand the underlying, what we would call today, occult principles around which all of these things take place. There is also implied the fundamental principles around which the specialized systems of occult knowledge and traditions developed. So it's going to be a fascinating exploration, but before we enter the chapter, we have to review the larger context in which this is taking place. Recall that a few chapters earlier, he described what it is to ascend directly into a poise of a liberated consciousness in the oneness in which we must learn to live. But from the oneness that is achieved by this narrow ascent, he then turns back upon creation and, as if unites all the disparate aspects of creation under that foundation of oneness, a top-down foundation, so to say, and weaves this unification all the way down to the material plane. That makes possible for us to experience the oneness all the way down in the material world. For this purpose, he took up, to begin with, 2 principles which are as if at the root of this whole sense of division and separation, and that is the principle or duality of Purusha and Prakriti, soul and nature, consciousness and power of consciousness. And understanding this and the multiple relations that the consciousness can have with its energy, we saw 6 facets in particular. We also saw how at the highest, energy is power of consciousness, and consciousness is the foundation or origin of that creative energy. All of that being explored earlier in the last chapter that we studied in depth. He discussed the nature of the individual and his relation with the world and with God, and this three-way relationship between these, which makes possible for the world to express so many different experiences of consciousness. In each individual, a unique experience of the world, but also the possibility of each individual experiencing different levels of consciousness. An individual can be in a state of ignorance, while another individual can experience a poise of liberation without conflicting with each other, and yet remaining in a space of common nature, shared nature, in which each can learn from the other or interact with the other. And this three-way relationship between God, nature, and the individual makes possible that there can be innumerable experiences of the divine, of the world, of oneself. And all of these together make for the rich experience of creation that we have. But most importantly, allowing for so many individual experiences, it also allows for them to come together in a liberated consciousness, to recognize that each is oneself in a different poise, in a different line of growth, but allowing eventually for a shared relationship of the divine in a group, in the whole universe, which would make possible the experience of a divine life on earth, in the material plane. Now, all of this has been the implication of the last chapter we read, and now with this foundation he is looking at what it is that keeps the soul in the sense of being bound, the relationship that soul has with nature, that it can literally modulate and experience an ascent of levels of consciousness, and how these levels emerge. So the chapter itself is titled, obviously, The Planes of Our Existence. Our existence. We live on all these planes at the same time. They exist, at least, at the same time for us, even if the focus of our awareness is fixated on one plane or a part of one plane. But the fact is, we have access to all these planes. They are our planes, planes of our existence. So the chapter, the title itself is suggestive of how important this discussion will be. If the Purusha in us has thus to become, by union with its highest self, the divine Purusha, the knower, Lord, free enjoyer of its Prakriti, it cannot be done evidently by dwelling on the present plane of our being, for that is the material plane in which the reign of Prakriti is complete. Now, in the very first line, he has summarized the broad discussion so far. We have to ascend by union with our highest self into the poise of the liberated Purusha, who is the knower, who is the Lord, and who freely enjoys his power of self-expression, that is Prakriti. But rationally, this is not possible when we are in a domain of experience where we feel ourselves bound by nature. We feel ourselves literally formed by nature. If my body was not created by the food that I eat, if it was not created by the biological processes of evolution and otherwise, I would not exist. So it feels to the Purusha, the soul, bound in this nature. And in the material plane, this binding is most complete. So complete that he says the reign of Prakriti is complete, meaning we cannot exist without the support or action of Prakriti. As you ascend the levels of consciousness, the planes of consciousness, you will find the relationship shifts. And in the highest, the Purusha is completely free, and nature is only his free expression of power. But even he will explain to us that these planes are nothing but relationships between Purusha and Prakriti. And it will be one of those radical, life-changing perspectives that he will throw at us, after which you will never look at the world the same again. But that is to come later. So here he is describing the material plane, in which the reign of Prakriti is complete. There, the divine Purusha is entirely hidden in the blinding surge of her activities, in the gross pomp of her workings, and the individual soul emerging from her involution of spirit and matter, subject in all its activities to its entangling in the material and vital instruments, is unable to experience the divine freedom. So two important ideas here. The Purusha cannot experience its divine freedom when it is bound like this. On the other side, the first idea is that the divine Purusha is hidden by this whole drama of Prakriti around him. So if we just take a simple example of a flower, do you see the divinity in the flower? Obviously not. We see only the form of the flower, the color of the flower, we smell its perfume and so on. At best we can infer that there might be a divinity. We can infer that there is a life energy perhaps, which makes all this possible. But you do not see the life energy, you do not experience it directly, and certainly you do not see the divinity. And so this is the nature of this material plane. The divine Purusha is entirely hidden. In what? And he describes two processes of nature which hide. First, in the blinding surge of her activities. There is this enormous power which flows, and it is so intense that it blinds you from the divinity which is concealed. It's a very interesting idea. It means the divinity is actually there, can be seen, but the light of that divinity never manages to reach your senses, which are blinded by this intensity of nature's play. If you were to ascend to higher planes, it would be the opposite. The divine presence would be so intense as to blind or dissolve any contrary concealing influence. From that extreme to this extreme, there are many intermediate levels where there are degrees of this. In the subtle physical world, for example, already one begins to experience everything as if semi-translucent. Looking at the flower, you can almost as if see the life force playing in it, as if it is glowing inside. Or you ascend a few more levels and you see only life force, the form is secondary to the life force. You ascend still higher and you experience not life force, but the idea and brightly lit idea of flower which wraps around itself the life force and guides it in its whirl. You perceive already there the sense of the soul of flower. And so you have a very interesting smooth transition from this one extreme where the light of the soul is entirely covered to that poise where the light of the soul is entirely revealed, and in between is only degrees of relationship between the two. So the first means by which the divine Purusha is hidden is the blinding surge of her activities. In other words, the light of that divine Purusha may still reach you, but your sight is blinded by this other thing which is so much brighter. The second thing with which she conceals the Purusha is in the gross pomp of her workings. So pomp is showiness and complexity of showiness. So if you look at an object, any object in the material plane, you can appreciate all the wonders of the experience. Oh, the leaf is like this. But if you begin to analyze it, you will find layers and layers and layers of working. So at a very superficial level, you say, oh, this leaf is made of such and such chemicals or molecules or qualities of medicine. But as you penetrate deeper, the molecules are made of more complex processes, which are made of more complex processes, and so on. In the analysis of a single cell in the human body and its process of building proteins, the charts that scientists have worked out are so large, you can write in fine print on paper and the chart will be at least 1 meter square, in fine print describing an entire grid of complex interactions of the protein synthesis chains of dependencies, stages and steps of the synthesis. So complex to build a single protein in a tiny cell which is building many different kinds of proteins at any given time. That level of intricacy, that is what he is referring to as the pomp of her working. But the pomp of her working is gross. You could have had a subtle complexity, but there's a grossness, a dullness, a heaviness which is what blocks the perception of the next layer. As you go up the chain of, as you go up the levels of consciousness, you do experience the multiplicity, and the depth and complexity is perhaps even more rich in a certain way, but it's no more gross, it's subtle. So looking at the flower, you may experience so many levels of working of complexity. When you look at a human being, you will see the layers of the aura and the bright play of colors and patterns which are constantly playing around. And it is as complex perhaps, as rich perhaps, but it is not covering. That is, the outer layer of the aura does not cover the inner layer. You see all the layers as if in a transparency. And so the second character by which nature conceals the divine Purusha is this gross pomp of her workings. And so let's reread the sentence. There, that is in the material plane, the divine Purusha is entirely hidden in the blinding surge of her activities, in the gross pomp of her workings. And the individual soul, emerging from her involution of spirit in matter, subject in all its activities to its entangling in the material and vital instruments, is unable to experience the divine freedom. So the consequence of those two things is this, that nature has as if entered an involution from spirit into matter, which is what makes for this gross pomp and all this blinding surge. And as a result, the individual soul struggling to emerge from this is at every point subject to in all its activities to its entangling in the material and vital instruments. As you emerge, you are dependent on the material and the vital instruments by which the soul is able to organize its individuality in nature. Being dependent means at every step you feel as if you could not exist without those things. So at a very human level, we can say we won't survive without food and water. We won't survive without the oxygen of the air around us. But if you just step back one level out of physical matter into the vital body, none of these things matter suddenly. When you re-enter the physical body, oh, I need air, I need food, water. When certain kinds of occult phenomena are demonstrated in which this kind of dependence of the physical material is not there, or rather that dependence is transcended somehow, it's because an operation which is natural to the vital or mental domain has been brought forward and impressed upon the physical matter, and that's all there is to it. There are yogis, for example, who seem not to be able to eat at all, or who can be buried underground for many days at a time in a state of semi-trance in which their breathing stops, even the heartbeat seems to stop, and yet after many days they come out of that trance and they are fine. But what do they do in the exercise of that demonstration is they access the life force directly at a level which is more gross, dense, approaching almost the materiality of the physical body. And if you're able to absorb that grade of life energy, well, you do not need oxygen, you do not need food, because our oxygen and food intake is only an indirect physical method of accessing that density of life force. If you can access it directly, you can ignore this process. So when you think about how it works, it's not such a big deal. But the dependence still exists. You stopped eating food, you stopped breathing air, but you still were dependent on that gross, denser grade of life energy that you had to absorb from outside you. Just because you took the level of dependence to a higher grade doesn't mean it was not there. The reality is we are dependent to be able to continue to live in this biological machinery. We are dependent on nature. So, subject in all its activities to its entangling in the material and vital instruments. Entangling shows you that it is not a simple attachment. It's as if all the threads of your energy flows are bound inside the physical and vital material that nature has organized around you. You cannot separate yourself easily, and this entangling is one of the keys to understand why it is so difficult to be free. You may try, for example, even in your thought, to stand back from an emotion which is bothering you, to stand back from a physical discomfort. It's too hot, too cold, it's paining, whatever is bothering you. Try in your thought to stand back, and you will find you're pulled back somehow. You step back again, you're pulled back. The moment the effort of stepping back is relaxed, you find yourself tending to pull back. Why? Because in your effort to pull back, you never really got free enough. There are threads of consciousness, threads of energy, even threads of material substance which are plugged in, which are pulling you. And they are elastic, so you can pull back for a while, but the moment you let go, they pull you again. And this entanglement is so deep to the very form, to the very nature of our material being, that you cannot cut it out without destroying it all. So these are insights he gives you in a very broad statement with a few key words, key ideas thrown in, and all these insights will be elaborated upon later. But here we understand how complex the situation is. And therefore, as a result of this subjection, the Purusha is unable to experience the divine freedom. What it calls its freedom and mastery is only the subtle subjection of mind to Prakriti. So when we say that now in my consciousness I have stepped back as a Purusha poise, I am free in my consciousness now. Alright, there is pain in the body, but I am not pain. Alright, my emotions hurt, but I am not emotions. But at that point, you may feel as if you're free, but it is not true freedom or mastery. He says, it is only subtle subjection of mind to Prakriti, which is lighter indeed, nearer to the possibility of liberty and rule than the gross subjection of vital and material things. So you find this freedom which you have can only be had in the mind. You cannot have it easily in the vital or material levels, where you are so deeply entangled. And even in the mind where you have this freedom, it is not a true freedom, it is only a subtler subjection. Because the subjection has become subtle, it feels as if you can be free and you can be master in your mind. The reality is that even when the yogi is in that poise of apparent mental freedom, if you stick a needle into his veins and inject certain chemicals, the fellow will lose his power of awareness and go to sleep. So is that really a poise of freedom? If the consciousness was truly free, you could do anything to the body and the mind could stand back. In fact, the true freedom is had at a level which involves a higher grade of mind, and when you do live in it, then you can inject things in the body and the consciousness would still be present. Even if the body goes to sleep, you would still be there and say, my body has been knocked unconscious, but I am present. There is a peculiar example which is referenced by Sri Aurobindo and also by the mother, when at a certain stage of his yoga, when he had already reached the supramental consciousness and was working to establish it more and more into the vital and physical parts of the body, he had, as an experiment to see the effect on his body, he had taken a certain psychotropic substance. I think it was bhang or marijuana or one of those types, which is often used in India by certain yogis, and he wanted to see the effect it had, and he took that and he said it had no effect at all. And that was it. He never had to go back to it. But that mention which he makes, it had no effect at all, people look at it as something mysterious. Oh, he was so advanced, somehow that thing had no effect. But if you understand the rationale of it, that thing has an effect in the levels of consciousness which are bound in the life energy on which this chemical is operating. If you are able to be free of it entirely, even free of the mind part which is subject to life force, then any of those things entering the body, you'll say, all right, the body gets somehow dull, heavy or whatever, but your consciousness is exactly what it was. It made no difference at all. So we understand the nature of this binding as well as what the true freedom would be like. But the point he makes is what it calls its freedom and mastery is only the subtle subjection of mind to Prakriti. The subjection is subtle, but it is there. In fact, it is there also on many other levels, even in the domain of mind, when, for example, such a person would find at first themselves troubled by the thoughts of others around them. One of the first things that happens when you free yourself in the mental consciousness is you become intensely aware of what's happening in the mental domain. And if you enter a space which is cluttered with all kinds of thoughts, it hits you. Can you then be free of that also to a poise where even those things will not intrude or affect? And yes, it's possible, but it means going a step higher. So we are nearer to the possibility of liberty and rule than the gross subjection of vital and material things like the animal, plant and metal. But it is still not real freedom and mastery. You are more free, closer to real freedom, but it's not real freedom or real mastery. But the example which he gives of gross subjection to vital and material things is of these things: animal, plant and metal. And these represent 3 grades. And all 3 grades are of course in our consciousness. We live much more in the higher part of the animal grade of consciousness of mind, but still in those lower gradations that you see in nature, you see how much more subject they are. But in us, where all these grades are also mapped out, we have the same level of subjection. Even though the mind stands out, the part of the mind which is embedded in the animal level of consciousness has the same subjection that you see in any other animal, or the part which is of the grade of the plant consciousness, that is conscious, subconscious tissue. There also the same subjection exists, and in the most material part of the physical body, which is of the same grade as metal or stone, you will have the same subjection. So what we experience in us is all the variations of subjection, and only some higher part of the mind as if stands back to a kind of a relative freedom and mastery, but not real freedom and mastery. Can that be possible? And so he gives the next observation. Therefore we had to speak of different planes of our consciousness and of the spiritual planes of the mental being. For if these did not exist, the liberation of the embodied being would have been impossible here on earth. You will recall many chapters earlier, there was this whole question of how does one get free, considering that we are subject to things of lower consciousness, that our mind itself is a product of a lower reality of consciousness and is fundamentally not of the nature of the spirit. How can mind experience spirit, or how can mind be liberated into spirit? And there he had given us the clue, and that became the means for the further evolution, that in the domain of mind itself there are finer grades. Higher than the range of reasoning mind are still finer grades of mental consciousness, but there are grades which are of the nature of the spirit, but in mind. If this did not exist, you could either leap into spirit and have no memory in the mind or no experience of it in the mind, or fall into mind and have no memory or experience of spirit. Because there are finer gradations of mind in which, or which are of the nature of spirit, we can enter those levels through which you can experience the spirit in mind. And therefore the mind can remember what it is like to experience spirit. Therefore the mind can live in the consciousness of spirit while being engaged in life. If those grades did not exist, it would have been impossible. And that's the point he makes. For if these did not exist, the liberation of the embodied being would have been impossible here on earth. He would have had to wait, and at most to prepare himself for seeking it in other worlds and in a different kind of physical or spiritual embodiment, less obstinately sealed in its shell of material experience. Now again, in a few suggestive words, he is revealing extraordinary insights. First, if this did not exist, that there are finer grades within the mind, you would have had to wait. Or at most in the physical life you will prepare for, when you shed the body, you're thrown out of this gross domain, then you can enter those higher worlds for which you can prepare for. So the suggestion is, at the time of shedding of the body, which world do you enter? The grade of consciousness that you have prepared yourself for is the world that you will enter. And this is the reason why in all the spiritual traditions, without exception, even those which seek a realization beyond, and especially in those perhaps, they give enormous importance to the state of consciousness at the time of passing out. If at that time your mind is dwelling upon, oh, I wish I could do this, oh, I'm going to miss that, your consciousness is turned down, then as you leave the physical body, that's the grade of consciousness that you're going to enter. If at that moment you have strong desire for food or for some other impulse of ownership and attachment to your possessions or treasures, well, that's the grade into which your consciousness is going to slip in the vital worlds. So we have to view it this way. In the physical world, our mind is experiencing things of the grades which correspond to the vital and mental worlds to the extent they are embodied in the physicality. But you're living in that grade of consciousness here. So when you're thrown out of the physical world, that's the grade that you slip into. And if it is the world of desires, well, that's the domain that you're going to live in there. But if at that moment your mind is turned to the higher spiritual possibilities, you're immersing yourself in the oneness of the divine consciousness, well, that's the grade of spirit into which you will slide because you were living in that vibration already. The problem with this picture is, in the physical world, you have these grades which correspond up there. So the way Sri Aurobindo maps it, in the descending movement, there are the different planes of consciousness all the way to matter. And in the ascending movement, in the physical body, all these planes of consciousness are being organized as you grow. So now you see, the plant has grown up to here, the animal has grown up to here, the human has grown up to here, corresponding to the mind grade. So the level of consciousness on which you are, your physical body is shed, you live in that world. You grow higher, you live in that world when the body is shed. Because you're already living in that world while in the physical body. However dulled it may be. That is where your consciousness is turned. So, very important insight. He would have had to wait and at most to prepare himself for seeking it in other worlds. So just by this suggestion, he is revealing a certain insight. But this in fact is the goal in so many religions, which declare that you will have your heaven after death, so now you prepare yourself with all whatever doing good or worshipping or whatever things which would align yourself to that, to those domains. There's a truth to it. But in the very act of saying there is only the divine world there and not here, you have missed out the much bigger truth, which is that the divine is here equally. And here's another insight he throws. And in a different kind of physical or spiritual embodiment, less obstinately sealed in its shell of material experience. What is this? And here we find a couple of extraordinary insights. Here in the physical world, what's the problem? The shell of material experience seals your consciousness. When you move to the vital world, in the vital body, the shell of vital experience, surrounds your consciousness but doesn't seal it. And the same for other planes. In the physical consciousness, there is the binding, the sealing, the blocking out of everything else. The problem of sealing is it prevents you from accessing other things. What happens when people take drugs is that momentarily that seal is weakened or holes are poked in it, which suddenly exposes you to things of the vital or mental worlds, while still being largely bound in the physical. The result is you do not see the vital worlds as they are, you see them as your consciousness transcribes them in physical terms. So it is not truly a liberation in the vital plane, rather it is a transcription in limited consciousness of body of a perception of the vital plane as if through a window. But the seal is never really gone. All it has done is given you a few glimpses, a few rays of light from things around. It can be useful for a person who is so totally sealed that breakthrough opens to him the reality, oh, there is more to the universe. But that's about all it can give you. So the character of the physical plane is obstinately sealed in its shell of material experience. And the seal is so obstinate you cannot break it. But there could be other levels in which you have a sealing but less obstinate. And what is that? So a different kind of physical or spiritual embodiment, less obstinately sealed in its shell of material experience. Meaning there are levels but less obstinately sealed. And this is what Sri Aurobindo refers to as subtle physical. He even refers to finer grades of matter, of material experience, of material world, which belong properly to the material domain, but are of finer grades. And you could, for example, shift to one of those, and there you would still experience your body like this. You can touch it, touch objects. It will be effectively indistinguishable from the normal physical plane, but it would be less obstinately sealed. What does it mean? It means somehow in that world you will feel the underlying reality of things. You will look at the flower and you'll say, I can feel the flower is conscious. It's speaking to me. This is what people do experience when they are high on certain drugs, where you're looking through and you're glimpsing these things. But without the drugs, by entering a vehicle which is not of the densest gross physical, but subtler physical, you will have the same experience. And you could, for example, exteriorize from your gross physical body in that grade of dense body, go around, literally touch things, do things even, and then come back. If it happened to you inadvertently, you would not know that your physical body, gross physical body, is still on the bed. And in fact, this is a problem when people have those experiences. I'm going to refer to a series of experiences which have been documented. I've mentioned many years ago that the US military was experimenting with what they called remote viewing. And it was really a method of projecting consciousness or reflecting things from a distance into your consciousness to see. Their goal was, of course, spying. And because the goal of spying is not so much to know what another person is thinking, but to see what they are doing, the whole focus was on a level which was very close to the material plane. What they discovered in the process was they could also perceive emotions and thoughts. They could also influence emotions and thoughts. So a whole domain of what they call remote influencing was also developed. And with it they realized they were vulnerable to others doing the same thing to them. So they developed a whole means of remote protection from remote viewing or influencing. And effectively it became a whole basis for occult warfare. But at a very crude physical level, but because the goal was still physical. So in the kind of experiences that some of them had, which are documented by them subsequently when they came out of the program, these were people of very high ethics and integrity who document how, one of them describes how he would go project himself in his, they didn't have the vocabulary, they just did it, they projected themselves into a space, observed things, came back. And then they discovered sometimes they were not sure if they had come back. They thought they had come back, but in fact something was off. The world was not quite the way it should be. And they were not sure, and they had to struggle to find ways to come back. In one example which this person gives, he projected out, did his observations, and then came back, woke up in his body, got up and started moving around. And then he came to the same place which he had been spying upon. It was just a few rooms down. And he discovered that right there was a bear sitting on a chair. And I said, oh my God, then this is still that subtle world. He comes back, wakes up in his body, goes out again and discovers something else is off and comes back. Up to 6 times he had to do that until he entered the gross physical domain and he was sure it was physical. In practice, it was indistinguishable. I had similarly met another person who had many spontaneous experiences of this kind, and he had no vocabulary or philosophical framework to explain it. He said, one day I just woke up and I was on this remote island in a different part of the world, and it was very physical. It was not in a dream, it was not imagination, it was not out of body. He said, I could pick up stones, I could do things. And I stayed there for 2 or 3 days. What was that? And then I came back. I don't know how I went, how I came back. So he was convinced it was a physical experience. Then when I checked with him, he said, yes, when I came back, it was back in the same bed where I had gone to sleep. So then I explained that there is this thing, there are gradations of the physical world. And I said, oh yeah, you see, that's the advantage of being in a tradition which explains these things. Otherwise, I didn't know what I was doing. But the experience he was so convinced was of the physical world, because everything was matching the physical domain. So if you read some of the literature of these people working in the military, the only way they could know was tiny things were slightly off. Somehow an object was different or misplaced, or the table was in a different location than it is normally placed, and they knew something is off. That's about all they could make out. So here is a suggestion that you could live in one of these gradations and not have the same degree of obstinacy of being sealed in the material experience. If you went a few degrees off, still in the subtle physical, then you could even experience your body not aging, for example. And so, or at least aging much slower. And you will have stories of people who have found a cave that took them inside some sacred mountain, and inside was a whole community of people and things like that, and they came out and they couldn't find it again. And they couldn't find it again because the entrance was not in the physical but in the subtle physical. And so you have experiences of this kind which are so vividly physical that they think it's a physical cave inside the mountain. It need not be. It could be one of these finer gradations where you are able to live a more spiritual life without this dulling, even sealing, which comes with the gross physical. Why then should we want to be in the gross physical? And in fact, many traditions did aim at that they refine their consciousness so much that they can somehow move off and then live in those domains and never again have to come back. And this would be the case, that you would have to do this if there was not the possibility of these finer gradations in the mind also. And if in the physical there are finer gradations, in the mind there are gradations which correspond to the higher gradations of consciousness. So let's come back to this picture, the descending ladder of evolution and then the ascending ladder of evolution. We have come up to a certain stage of conscious intellectual mind, but the range of mental consciousness is higher, and there are finer levels there which we have not yet awakened to, which we need not awaken to if the goal is simply to snap out into spirit by abandoning this, or to get out of this back into that inner realm of ascending series of consciousness worlds. But if the goal is to experience here those spiritual states, then we continue the ascent within the mental region. And corresponding to those higher planes are gradations within the mind in which you can live, and from which you can experience the reality of those worlds, those planes of consciousness, while being still embodied. So, different kind of physical or spiritual embodiment is also possible, less obstinately sealed. So many of the so-called immortal beings, you've heard of stories of Babaji who lives in the Himalayas, who will materialize and come, and he's always young. You've heard stories of Ashwatthama or other beings from a distant past who are still immortal, and they've been met by people. In fact, there are documented and trustworthy, reliable descriptions of people who have met them. I have had contact with some people like that who have had that kind of a concrete experience. But the fact is, the form materialized. You had an access and then it went off. It didn't belong to the physical world. Now, if you came to the conclusion that this gross physical world is intractable, cannot be divinized, well, that would be the only way to go about it. But Sri Aurobindo's affirmation is, this world is intended to be divinized, and that's what we will see shortly, the logic of it. And if it is intended, then the whole intention of nature is also to divinize it, and it's also the purpose why we are here. So, therefore, we had to speak of different planes of our consciousness and of the spiritual planes of the mental being. Now, this being the case, he has very quickly summarized discussions across many chapters, and then he contrasts our approach with the conventional approach of a yoga of knowledge. In the ordinary yoga of knowledge, it is only necessary to recognize two planes of our consciousness, the spiritual and the materialized mental. Materialized mental is the term he is using here, which in later vocabulary he uses the phrase physical mind. That is, the mind consciousness turned to matter or materialized in matter, bound in matter. So materialized mental is this consciousness that is our normal state when we say, I am thinking. It's a mental consciousness, but it is the mental as it is bound in the material body. If you were to knock out the physical body just like that, suddenly this consciousness will enormously expand and widen out and be much more free and light. And this is not difficult to experience. You don't have to shed your body for it. A very simple practice Sri Aurobindo suggests is shift the center of thought out of the brain to the top of the head or just above the head. And when you can shift your mental status there, already realize your mind becomes so clear, wide and free. And if you shift it back in, it feels again a narrowed, dulled, heavy working. And it's as simple as that, to shift the center. Of course, it takes a while for you to fully center yourself and experience the full freedom, but once you have a glimpse of that, you will find it's not worth it to be bound in the dullness. But here is the materialized mental consciousness, and then above that, the spiritual that you want to get to. And that's all. These two are all that matter. The rest doesn't matter. Even the vital and physical don't matter except to the extent that they bind you. The pure reason, standing between these two, views them both, cuts through the illusions of the phenomenal world, exceeds the materialized mental plane, sees the reality of the spiritual. So he's summarizing now the process of the normal, ordinary yoga of knowledge. There are these two planes, in between is this reason, pure reason. Not the reason embedded into the materialized mind. You see, the reason which is embedded here down is busy justifying either your desires or your practical necessities. When pure reason stands back, it questions everything, it questions its own existence, and that's generally the domain where the philosophical thinking starts. It's not enough to have the scientific thinking, which is still primarily obsessed with physical process. The pure thought standing back that says, why am I here? Who am I truly? And that's where the pure reason separates. And so it is between these two planes, the spiritual and the materialized mental. It cuts through the illusions of the phenomenal world. So it starts observing, I am not body, I am not this, I have emotions, I have thoughts, I am none of these, what am I? It cuts through the appearance and finds some deeper poise. Sees the reality of the spiritual. And this is the part in us which says, yes, that is true. There is something like this which is spiritual, but I can't experience it fully and vividly. It's still something almost inaccessible, but I can still feel the reality of it. And then, the will of the individual Purusha, unifying itself with this poise of knowledge, rejects the lower and draws back to the supreme plane, dwells there, loses mind and body, sheds life from it, and merges itself in the Supreme Purusha, is delivered from individual existence. So in very short steps, he has described the whole process. The moment you're convinced that there is a spiritual, you've cut through the appearance of the phenomena, what's the next thing? The will of the individual Purusha unifying itself with this poise of knowledge. Here is the spirit which I feel, and now I turn more and more to merge into this. rejecting the lower, drawing back to the supreme plane. So there is a double movement. As you merge in the higher, you cut off and reject anything of the lower which holds you back. Dwells there, so there is a period of stability, and then increasingly as that period of stability grows, mind and body begin to fade. So losing of mind and body, sometimes even they become less efficient, less effective, lot of interest, even they sheds life from it and merges into the Supreme Purusha, and that you are freed from individual existence. Having got to that reasonably close stage, or even having reached it fully, there's still a problem. It knows that this is not the whole truth of our existence, which is much more complex. It knows there are many planes, but it disregards them or pays little attention to them because they are not essential to this liberation. Now, when this is being done, the it which is doing this, the individual Purusha, even before it has reached the higher ranges, it can recognize, oh yes, there are levels. At the very least, we realize even our mind has multiple levels, our life energy has levels. So it knows that the reality is more complex, but it disregards or pays little attention. Because for this goal, what does it matter? So you will recall the famous incident of the Buddha being asked, is there God? And he keeps silent. And so this is taken by certain types of Buddhists to say that he was saying no. No, if it was a no, he would have said no, there is no God. But he remains silent. Because if he were to say yes, there is God, then the whole problem would shift in a different direction from his objective, which was to find the shortest way out of suffering by merging into the Absolute. God is irrelevant for that purpose. But he couldn't say no either, he couldn't say yes either, so he keeps silent. Because it is not of relevance for his mission, for his message, for his solution to the problem of life. And so, at that poise, one can still recognize the reality of these things, but they are irrelevant for this goal. It disregards them or pays little attention to them because they are not essential to this liberation. They indeed rather hamper it. The fact of many planes can come in the way of this liberation, because to live on them brings new attractive psychical experiences, psychical enjoyments, psychical powers, a new world of phenomenal knowledge, the pursuit of which creates stumbling blocks in the way of its one object, emergence in Brahman. So here's the problem. If you recognize those worlds, if you start now engaging with them, you have just shifted out of lower phenomena to higher phenomena. And in those higher phenomena, well, you have attractive psychical experiences. They are, in fact, very attractive. So attractive that you might even momentarily lose your focus of this higher purpose. Second, psychical enjoyments. You can enjoy yourself so much more there that, well, why would you want to immerse yourself in the one Brahman? Why not just enjoy these domains which are, well, if they exist, they are meant for your enjoyment, isn't it? And psychical powers. From that poise of freedom of the Purusha, you can exercise your will much more directly on all the workings of nature. And you can do things which you couldn't do otherwise. Effectively, you have a whole world of phenomenal knowledge, the pursuit of which creates stumbling blocks in the way of its one object, emergence in Brahman, and brings a succession of innumerable wayside snares on the road which leads to God. So you have decided that your road to God is only that, and this is the way, and God is only that, and nothing else is God. And so everything in between, all these intermediate planes, offer you what effectively appear to be traps which will digress from this road. Now you will see in almost every religious tradition, there is a passage the founder goes through where he is offered powers which attract him, or which he is now supposed to reject and say, no, but I want only that and I reject. But there's a brief period of temptation. And the idea is this precisely. In your ascent, you will meet these things because they exist. What do you do with them? So in the example which comes to mind is of a person I had met. He used to be earlier a businessman. He always had a strong spiritual leaning, and he had become a disciple of Master Shen of the Chan Buddhist tradition, an extraordinary being who had reached some of the highest experiences of the nirvanic passage and experience. He was leading a retreat where this man was present, and he wrote afterwards of his experience and shared this. And he said at some point he had reached the poise of consciousness where he was so full of bliss and he was immersed in bliss for hours. At which point the master noticed what had happened to him, and then he called him aside afterwards and said, you have to go beyond the bliss. It's a trap if you stay stuck there. So in the next session, he went beyond, he rejected this as a intermediate zone which is trapping him, and he merged into that, and he said, I don't know, I was knocked out for 6 hours. I came back with no memory of that transcendence. The problem was, and this was the whole thing when I met with him, you could see it was a man on whom those things had left a stamp. There was a kind of a depth to his consciousness because of that imprint of experience, but he didn't have it. He didn't have it because he could only attain to it in a loss of mind, or coming back to mind in a loss of the spirit. If instead he had recognized the intermediate stages and worked to bridge them, or even ascend them step by step until he could experience even the transcendence without losing the thread of continuity, that could be possible. Or at least being close to it enough that he could experience the transcendence while still being embodied. Then he might have been able to live in it perhaps. But that was not the particular path that he was following, and so there was this gap. But in between, the point was that here was a domain of extraordinary joy, blissfulness, which had to be also abandoned to get to the true goal. And these can be treated as snares. They trap you, they bind you. Now there's a truth to it. The reality is we want to go all the way to that. But we also recognize these in a different way. And this is the approach Sri Aurobindo gives. But since we accept world existence, and for us all world existence is Brahman and full of the presence of God, these things can have no terrors for us. So the whole perspective with the integral yoga is different, and again it summarizes discussions in previous chapters. We have seen the divine itself is a manifestation of the world itself is a manifestation of the divine, and the divine immanent entirely here. And although there is a poise of transcendence, there is equally the poise of immanence, full of the presence of God. And so even if you were to explore these domains in between of these levels, you would still explore them as domains of the presence of God, not as powers which deflect from your goal where God is only in the transcendence. God is equally here. So that changes completely the game. So he says, these things can have no terrors for us. Whatever danger of distraction there may be, we have to face and overcome them. In fact, in the ascent, there is every likelihood of something of the ego consciousness remaining up to a very high stage. There is every likelihood of mixtures even of your vital or mental nature which seize upon those experiences and draw them for their own justification or use. And all these dangers exist. But he says, we have to face and overcome them. If the world and our existence are so complex, we must know and embrace their complexities in order that our self-knowledge and our knowledge of the dealings of Purusha with its Prakriti may be complete. If there are many planes, we have to possess them all for the divine. Even as we seek to possess spiritually and transform our ordinary poise of mind, life and body. So in these two sentences, this is the goal placed before us. But now let's look at the nuances, because there are interesting suggestions here. If the world and our own existence are so complex, immediately the suggestion is our own existence is as complex as the world. You see, the truth of it is we are a microcosm. Everything that's out there is represented in us equally. And if out there is this extraordinary complexity, how complex? Well, broadly, 7 planes, or because 7 principles which form the cosmos, within each of them, all 7 principles, so 49 finer gradations. Each of these gradations is further interacting with each other, and within each there can be again the 7 principles further discovered to make for a multiple of 7, and within each you could draw out any complex mix of the 7 principles. And each is interacting with everything else within a narrow band of one plane and across planes. And this is the reality of the cosmos. If you truly want to embrace the universe the way the divine embraces it, then you have to embrace with this full complexity. But equally, if within us the same thing is held in microcosm and you want to know yourself truly, well, you have to embrace that complexity. So, if the world and our own existence are so complex, we must know and embrace their complexities. So, know and embrace, what's the difference? Knowing is a first step in which you become aware. But in awareness, you are not yet fully one with it. You have not yet mastered it. There is still something which is not you, but of which you are aware and with which you are engaging. So, in our first stage of development, we know that within us there are these different impulses. But when we embrace the impulses, we become conscious of them and one with them until they become as if our instruments of action. Within me is a creative impulse. I know it is there. I've experienced it sometimes. But when I embrace it, I'm one with the whole creative movement, which is now one of the instruments, one of the tools, one of the arms of my mind, so to say. This is the reason why you will find the divine represented sometimes in symbol with 100 arms or 1,000 arms. Again, 100 and 1,000 go back to the Vedic symbol, which Sri Aurobindo explains like this. 7 planes and 7 subplanes within each make for 49. 49 in the descending movement, 49 in the ascending movement. Remember, it's not just involution but evolution also completed make for the 98. And then the oneness out of which these emerge, and then the inconscience into which they are completely hidden make for the full 100. So 100 in the Vedic cosmology represents the totality of the manifestation in its multiplicity. And in each of these, there is the further possibility of powers which can be revealed tenfold. And so when 100 into 10,000 means the totality of the manifestation with all its powers fully released. And if you think about it in this way, if you were to experience that within yourself, each of these powers or impulses is like an arm of your consciousness pushing out to act, working. And so the consciousness which is so richly awakened and liberated in its working is experienced like 100-fold arms or 1,000-fold arms. So you will see Vishnu represented with 100 arms or 1,000, or the Buddha represented in 100 or 1,000 arms. But the idea is this: it is the full revelation in plenitude. And here they are embraced in their complexity. In order that our self-knowledge and our knowledge of the dealings of Purusha with its Prakriti may be complete. So 2 steps. First, in self-knowledge within us, we will develop the awareness in experience of the complexity of how our consciousness can relate to its energy, to Prakriti, but also recognizing through our subjective awakening how the large complex working takes place in the cosmos. If there are many planes, we have to possess them all for the divine. In the same way, he says, as we seek to possess spiritually and transform our ordinary poise of mind, life and body. So, possess and transform spiritually. Remember, you can possess and transform with any grade of consciousness. Your body is now possessed by your mind. Because your mind possesses it, you can move your hands the way your mind wills freely. Your physical body tissue has been transformed by mind. This is the reality of it. If it was not the case, you would not be able to control your body in this way. Now, there are parts of your body which are more transformed by mind and others less. Take, for example, your toes. Can you move your toes like this? No, you cannot. Your fingers you can. Why? Because the tissue of your toes has not been transformed by mind sufficiently. It is still dull and largely instinctive in its working. Try to move one toe without moving the others. Barely you can. But now keep at it, work at it for a while, and in a few minutes perhaps you will find you can move a single toe without moving others. And what did you do in that exercise? You infused your mind awareness into it and gripped it from within, mentalized the toe consciousness. And bit by bit you could take each of them, some more difficult because the smaller ones are less conscious, more dull to reach. But if you persist, in a few days or weeks, you'll find you can actually move your toes like this, the way you move your fingers of hands. And at that point we can say you mentalized the toe body tissue or the toe consciousness of the body. Now you can vitalize, meaning make more living. You can mentalize, means make more conscious. But the mentalization again has 2 degrees. Possess, and that's what you did when you entered the toe consciousness, you possessed it. You entered your finger consciousness to possess it. But then you transform it, and that's a much higher achievement which we have done largely instinctively and partially with our body. Our body is possessed by mind but not yet fully transformed by mind. If it was fully transformed, you would actually be aware of your digestive processes and you would be able to will it as you will your fingers. So we can say your fingers have been much more transformed, and then there are large parts of your body which are still subconscious to mind, not even seized, not even possessed, and much less transformed. And if this is possible with your current grade of mind awareness, what happens when your grade of mind awareness rises to something more high, more clear and pure? Can that seize upon these things and possess? Can it further refine, awaken and transform? And yes, when we actually do it, you will see one practical difference between your toes and your fingers. The skin of your fingers is more smooth, more clear, more conscious than your toes. Very simple difference. Why? It is more transformed by mind than your toes. If now you can bring a higher power into your hands, let's say the intuitive consciousness, just above the intellectual consciousness, and the intuitive consciousness fills your hands, you will find the fingers will have as if the knowledge of their own. So you want to, for example, lift 20 grams of sugar or salt to put into the food. Your hand will go and it will pick. If you weigh it, it will be exactly 20 grams. Is that possible? Yes, it's possible. Is that difficult? No, but you have to work at it. It's not going to happen automatically if you don't work at it. You can work at it indirectly, as when you're learning to play a musical instrument, then you're trying to make your hands more conscious, but also tuning your hands to work automatically to transcribe the music that you read or that you receive as an inspiration. And your hands move while your mind is here. And so there has been a kind of an lifting beyond the pure mentalization to something more intuitive, but slightly more intuitive. If you can consciously bring the intuitive consciousness into it, then this power becomes normal. And we have the example of Kapali Shastriyar, one of the disciples of Sri Aurobindo, one of the earliest disciples who was earlier with Ramana Maharshi and had gone very far in the path of self. And when he came to Sri Aurobindo, Maharshi shed a tear and said that there was only a very fine veil which separated his consciousness from Shastriyar's. But Shastriyar chose to follow the integral yoga with Sri Aurobindo, and at some point when Maharshi needed somebody to translate his writings, Shastriyar was called, and with Sri Aurobindo's blessings he went, completed the work and came back. But here was an extraordinary being in terms of his spiritual awakening. In his consciousness, that intuitivization had gone through in his body to such a degree. He was working in the department of paints in the ashram, and in those days you had to mix paints. You could not get a precise shade. So you had proportions of the 3 basic colors which you could buy and mix them to build the correct color that you needed. And his hand had that intuitivized ability. He could pick from the paint exact amount of what was required. When the hand has that ability, let's say you're preparing food, you will find the amount of food made is exactly what was needed for the number of people, and you finish down to the last piece, and so on. In the skill with which the finger works, it might even be able to do something for the first time and know exactly how to do it precisely with no error or hesitation. So this would be intuitivization of just the fingers. Imagine what that would mean if the intuitivization extended into the digestive process. The food digestion itself would have the innate knowledge of how to manage the food, but you would also be conscious of what's happening, what it is doing, and you could will into it what you need. Now all this is still intuitive consciousness which is operating at the level of finite awareness. If now this intuitive awareness opens to the still higher over mental consciousness, where it experiences things in infinities, finite appearances of infinities. So it would reach out to touch the flower, the hand itself would feel a finite projection of an infinite hand awareness, meeting flower which is finite projection of an infinite flowerness, and every sensory contact, every interaction would have that vivid experience of infinity meeting infinity in the physical body, in the physical senses. And from there, the step which will complete it will be the supramental consciousness, now thus bringing awareness and possessing spiritually, but not yet transformed. Transformation would mean now the tissue's internal working would have to change by the intuitive consciousness and eventually by the supramental consciousness. So we have not yet transformed the body fully in terms of mind. A little bit has happened. To that extent our body is consciously accessible to us. But its internal working is still a subconscious. When it is transformed, its internal working also would respond to the mind's will. You may or may not have full awareness of that internal working, but at least it should work in response to the mind's will. And that's already a big achievement. And when such a thing happens with the intuitive, that would be even greater. Now the problem is you cannot do it with your mind, because your mind is too weak a power to be able to transform the dullness of matter or even to awaken it fully. As a weak power, it can only weakly modify. But when the intuitive consciousness comes, it is a greater power and can more strongly modify. But still, there's a limit. It is only when the highest supramental consciousness can enter that it has the full power to seize upon, not only to possess spiritually, but transform entirely the mind, the vital, and the physical. So even as we seek to possess spiritually and transform our ordinary poise of mind, life, and body, in the same way we have to possess all the planes for the divine. Within us, obviously, initially, but the fact that you possess them within you gives you also the access in the cosmos, in the universe. And you begin to live in those planes in the universe. So again, as an analogy, as human beings, we are living on 3 gradations of the material experience. The dense physical experience I am able to touch. The emotional component of the experience I am able to feel, but also I can feel my relationship with flower, with other human beings. And then the mental grade within the physical experience, where I can have thoughts and ideas, but also I can share and exchange ideas with others. As a result, I have recast my physical life and my emotional life to become more representative of my mental values. And this is the reality in which we live. But when you meet an ape or a very conscious dog, it is able to share only in 2 levels of your reality, the physical and the emotional. But the thought part of your idea world, it can barely touch or hardly glimpse, catching a few thoughts, but only to the extent that they relate to his emotions and physical senses. But with a little bit of effort, perhaps he can momentarily reach out and glimpse a thought and say, wow, what was that? And the dogs can do that, the horses can do that, the apes can do that. By staying in conscious contact, constant contact with you, they can even seep in something of your mind organization, and it gets infused and organizes it a little bit in it, as far as its physical brain is able to take. It can even, if you live in a more psychicized consciousness, it can even absorb something of the psychicization of the individuality. Its psychic being becomes more organized, more individualized, more distinct, and more aware of its mental consciousness. Now all of this is possible, but still you will say, after all that is done, they miss out the full play of the mind experience. Go down a step to a still lower grade of animal or plant life, and there you find they don't even share directly in your emotional world. Yes, plants do respond to the energies you put out, but not as emotions, but as energy of life. An emotion is already of a grade which is mentalized, and here it is purely energy, and it is wonderfully beautiful when you experience that with plants. Their world is so pure in the play of energies, but they cannot share in these 2 higher gradations. When we as human beings meet a more intuitivized being, an overmental being or a supramental being, there is a similar gap. We do not share in their experience, which may include so many more levels of reality that not only they experience, but they can directly act upon the way we act upon the world through thoughts. Eventually, though, we should be able to experience the full spectrum of reality, all the 49 finer gradations, while living in the oneness, and from there deal with the inconscience equally, the full spectrum of life, of reality. So, if there are many planes, we have to possess them all for the divine. Even as we seek to possess spiritually and transform our ordinary poise of mind, life and body. So with this, the framework of the integral yoga is placed in contrast with the ordinary yoga of knowledge and its ordinary limited objective. Having said this now, Sri Aurobindo moves to how is this to be? What is the nature of this relationship of our soul with this complexity of nature? What makes for the experience of multiple planes? And what impact it has had in the past in human experience? So he has to always turn back to the best of what was done in the past and draw it and its relevance for the present and the future. So in the very next sentence, he gives you a historical and deeper perspective of this knowledge and to the extent that it has impressed human development in the past. The ancient knowledge in all countries was full of the search after the hidden truths of our being. And it created that large field of practice and inquiry which goes in Europe by the name of occultism. Now here's an extraordinary statement, and it comes from someone who has that vision of the three times, Trikala Drishti, of the past, present and future. And so his assessment of the history of humanity is also coming from that insight, as you will see in his writings in the ideal of human unity or the human cycle, where he is able to map out the developmental stages and processes of different civilizations going back thousands of years, and even suggests things of earlier cycles of civilization of which we have no record today. But with that kind of perspective, he makes the statement, the ancient knowledge in all countries was full of the search after the hidden truths of our being. All countries. There has never been a space on earth where this was not part of that search. Of course, in different areas, the approach of the search might have been different, the priority is different, but it was always there. In some cases, the breakthroughs made were more profound, in some cases more superficial, but still the search was there. And it's important to recognize this because today we don't see this anywhere. At least nowhere in the public discourse do we find this search after the hidden truths of our being. In a sense, the turn of evolution is once again bringing us back to the importance of this. It is what Sri Aurobindo has described as the subjective age, where reason has failed us, and particularly this materialized reason which only saw matter as the only reality. Having failed us now, there is a subjective turn. But the subjectivism is largely still of what do I do, what do I need for my immediate satisfaction of desire. There is not this hidden truths of our being, what makes us us. And if you are able to enter into that domain, he says, it created that large field of practice and inquiry. It opens us to something immense, because the reality is the moment you go a little bit deep within to these fundamental things, they open out into universality. Deeper within your mind, deeper within your vital ranges, you open out to the universe and have access to experiences on that level around you, in the universe, not just within you, but around you. You can engage with these powers, with these energies, with these processes, and directly impact them, engage with them also to influence them, but also draw from them specific knowledge and utilization. And so this creates a large field of practice and inquiry. First application is do something with it. So in the past, everywhere in the world, if you go back to the traditional knowledge, you will find medicinal knowledge for all the common illnesses. How did they discover it? And it was not done by a rational process. It was done by this intuitive, introspective process. So first part is application, practicing it. The second part, which is not there for everybody, but for a few who then push further, is the inquiry. What more? What more can I find? How much deeper can we go? And that was always left to an elite. So if you go back far enough, and that's not very far really, even if you go back 300 or 400 years ago, you will find the knowledge was prevalent. At least the practice of it, the inquiry among a few. In Europe, there was a very painful passage, which is a sharp cutoff where all this knowledge was not only suppressed but destroyed by destroying the people who carried it. And a large part of them were women. They were labeled the church witches. They were burnt at the stake, and the numbers go in millions. I don't know if I'm remembering right, but something like 20 million people, mostly women. They embodied that knowledge, they carried it, they had the access to these deeper powers and beings or processes within nature. They had awakened and developed it, and suddenly you snuff it all out within 100 years or so. What happens to the civilization? A fall into a most dulling material focus. The result was what you see today in the form of the philosophy or science as it then followed through in Europe. But if you go to other spaces where this kind of destruction did not take place, the traditions might still be intact, but with the intrusion of modernism, which is this reduced materialistic focus, much of that has been pushed back, lost. Traditions, lineages have been lost because people are no more interested in developing a deeper capacity that requires a commitment of many years. I want my certificate in 15 days, after which I can go and make money. So it stops there. But if somebody says, I can train you in this knowledge, but it's going to take you at least 15 years or 20 years of your life to come to some basic capacity, and after that you can work on your own to go deeper. How many are willing to commit? And that's the character of this modern age. And so a lot of knowledge is being very rapidly lost. I've had occasion many times to meet people who were at the end point of that, and they say, we don't have anybody who's willing to learn from us, and the knowledge is gone. Including very specific knowledge of even healing methods and remedies which you could draw from nature, as well as mantric or occult use for healing. My grandfather, for example, had this very particular knowledge he had received, which he could cure any kind of sickness formed by what they call, I think, the hookworm. And to maintain that technique, he had to sit and practice. During the time of an eclipse, he would be repeating the mantra to build its strength. And when somebody came to him with that particular problem, he would mix certain materials, grind it, and with the power of the mantra infused into it, that to give it once, and the person would be cured. At that time, there were no other medicines available which could do this. That knowledge was lost. He never passed it on. And I asked my mother, why didn't you learn it? I would have wanted to learn it. Maybe it was not meant to be, but it just was lost like that. But this is just one tiny example. There's so much more which was not passed on. And people today are not ready even to receive. So, practice and inquiry. And this broad framework which is called occultism. We do not use, Sri Aurobindo says, we do not use any corresponding word in the East. There is no such word for occultism. Because these things do not seem to us so remote, mysterious and abnormal as to the Occidental mentality. They are nearer to us, and the veil between our normal material life and this larger life is much thinner. And we'll have to discuss this in more detail next time. What is this veil? How does it act? And what can we do to make it thinner, at least in our personal life, or in our personal space, or even within our community? In fact, here, for example, in a sacred space, made sacred by the infusion of the spiritual presence, in a space like Auroville, that veil is thinner. And yet, within our individual consciousness, we can be dulled to it, or we can consciously become sensitive to it. And then we can glimpse things which are just across the veil and begin to engage with it. In a space like this, the little dwarfs, elves, fairies, beings which look after nature processes are happy if we take care of the space. They are drawn to the spiritual light which has been established here, and we can relate to them and ask for their help because the veil is thin. But there are certain requirements, so we'll discuss that next time. But it is time today, especially for those of us with a spiritual seeking, to consciously work to thin the veil in our spaces and bring back that smooth interchange which existed in the past. And then he mentions specifically in India, Egypt, Chaldea, China, Greece and Celtic countries, they have formed part of various yogic systems and disciplines which had once a great hold everywhere, but to the modern mind have seemed mere superstition and mysticism. But then he says the facts on which they were founded are as valid as the facts of the material world. So here he is going to give us a glimpse, and we will look at further implications of this, what those systems were or what was common among them next time. But after this, he says, it's not our intention to plunge into this vast and difficult field of psychical knowledge. But it becomes necessary now to deal with certain broad facts and principles which form its framework, for without them our yoga of knowledge cannot be complete. So what he is saying is, he will give us the broad framework of the laws and processes of this occult knowledge, and it will be spanning the next 2 or 3 chapters, from the most material to the highest spiritual, and the full occult framework upon which the occult knowledge is based. And then he says in the footnote, we hope to deal with it hereafter, this occult knowledge, psychical knowledge. But our first concern in the Arya must be with spiritual and philosophical truths. It is only when these have been grasped that the approach to the psychical becomes safe and clear. And yet, having said this, he will still give us the broad framework. So we are entering a very fascinating part of the study, and repeatedly it will go back to first principles on the spiritual foundations, and then from there draw out all the way to these occult principles and processes, and the full continuum of the knowledge will be given to us, at least in essential form, by which not only we can liberate our consciousness in the ascent of the Purusha, but also awaken and transform Prakriti, nature, to also rise in this awakening. So we pause here for now. We will continue this on Friday after next, as next Friday I have to be out of station. It was one of those things I couldn't avoid. And so we will meet on the 12th of April. We can take up any comments or questions. Mm-hmm. Yes.
Explaining about preparing for finding what can be this consciousness to prepare for it? Because it's going to be just a problem. We don't know how
Yes.
things will happen.
Yes. So the question about how to prepare in the transition for death, since that comes often as a surprise, or that's the time of greatest challenge if you are not prepared for it, when you might have maximum concern or worry, because it's not exactly something you're used to doing at least in your memory. And so the preparation is to die before. I'm putting it very crudely. To have undergone death, so that when you have to make the physical transition, it's not something new. I'm putting it crudely, as I said. The form of it is to be able to let go of your personal attachments and your personal desires, and to turn your consciousness to cling to that which is most valuable, which you want to hold. Not only in this life, but in the transition and into the next. So this reorienting of your priorities, of your consciousness, will take place on 3 levels. In your mind, thought, ideal, priority. In your heart's emotions, attractions, interests. And in your physical actions and their priorities. If you orient yourself now already to that which is more permanent, more true, more real, which brings you in closer intimacy with the Divine Presence, then you are already set. Whenever the time comes to shed the body, it makes no difference. Okay? So effectively, when I go back to that crude vocabulary, you have died to your old self. You have died to your ego's personal needs and desires and awakened to your spiritual self, or at least its influence. And then you are set. So if you think of it deeply, you realize it is nothing but the goal of the spiritual turn anyway. Only one must do it with a certain vividness, to center and organize yourself around your deepest aspiration and so on. If you were told right now you have to shed your body, would you be ready in this sense? And if you're not, then that's the work you have to do. To bring yourself to some degree of attunement to your spiritual aspiration and priority, that if you're told, okay, now it's time to shed, you say, okay, I'm ready. Then you're ready for it. But then you live with that consciousness in your daily life. Not with death as your reference, but with this poise where now it doesn't matter because you're already living it. That is your spiritual life anyway, isn't it?
When you tell one moment it touched me, but I don't understand really, you maybe develop it. When you lose your transcendence, you lose the memory. You can.
So if your mind and the spirit do not have something common to bridge, then when you enter into pure transcendence of spirit, the mind goes into a trance. It cannot register something which is beyond its capacity. So when you come back to it, it has no memory. It only feels there was something in which I lost myself. That's all. If in the mind there has already been developed a higher grade, and with it a sense of closeness to that transcendence, then you'll have the feeling it was a vast, timeless state where I was not anymore me. There was only that.
It depends on plan.
Yes. Depends on which plane, but also how much the mind has been acclimatized to coming in closeness to that point where there is immersion. So it is possible actually to gradually build or awaken these higher grades of awareness and develop them until one can experience oneself living on the brink of that complete transcendence. You live in a consciousness which is timeless, spaceless, indivisible oneness, which is all. And this your mind can experience, or this refined higher grade of mind can experience. From there you could then slip into that on the other side and return and not have a sense of complete loss. You would still have the sense, I'm merged into something which I cannot describe anymore. But these are the words I can use to close this. But I know, I remember the experience, at least as a shadow in the mind. But the continuity is not lost. And this would be our goal. Not only that, it should be our goal so that that is always present. And with the background and support of that, we live in this here and now.
In the subtle world, I would like to know how is the body constituted in the subtle world. When the body sleeps in the material world, and then you go in the subtle world, what kind of body do I have there?
Yes.
Because Shrivendra says he lives in the subtle world, and then Mother says, he was served lunch there, so I was through because I didn't want to disturb him. But it cannot be material. What is it? What is it then?
So in the subtle physical, you have also form and density of physical body. And you can do things, hold objects and so on. But if you go into the vital world, there the density of form is not there. There is only density of energy. And all energy interpenetrates. So flower energy is present here, and my hand energy or my extension of energy, which I call hand, goes right through. But I don't even need to reach out. Energetically, flower and I mingle, and I feel flower energy. But the form is not strong. Everything is flowing through everything else as energy. And in this realm of thought, in the mind world similarly, it is awareness as idea, flower idea and my idea, and idea meeting idea. So we do not have in those worlds any rigid sense of form. What happens in dream state is that a part of our mind projects into that space. So we are not really wandering with a body. We are wandering as a point of awareness which is able to perceive and see and experience things on those planes. But because we are living in the body consciousness, what we experience there is filled in with the mind's equivalent form experience. So in that world, I experienced a violent energy coming towards me, and my mind clothes that experience, which is without distinction of form, clothes it in the feeling of an energy which was flowing snake-like. So I saw a snake which was coming towards me. And that's how the dream is visioned in the consciousness. So all these dreams then we describe as symbolic. Now the snake is not an actual snake, but a force, an energy of some kind which was coming. So what did it feel like? Was it coming, was it a nice energy, or was it angry or something dark? And again, the mind clothed it in color which corresponded to the vibe of that energy. Oh, it was a golden snake, and it was actually nice. It was not trying to harm me, it was just coming to help me. Or it was a dark snake, it was coming to harm, it was wanted to kill. But the color is again how the mind perceives that grade or that quality of consciousness, and we then represent it in the waking consciousness as a form. So that's why you'll find sometimes dream has weird things. Things are not quite the way it would be. Like a snake comes and eats up your arm, and you pull your arm out and say, go away. Now you can't do that with a physical snake, obviously. And what does the arm mean for you? And if you go back into the feel of it, then the meaning is obvious. If you stay with the form of it, I don't know what it means. I saw a dove flying left to right. What does it mean? I don't know. But if I feel the energy of it, yes, this is what it was. And that's why we say it's symbolic. But the actual experience when you are shed from the physical body, at first you are more in the subtle physical where you still have a sense of form, you can see hands, but when that part is shed, then you are purely in the energy body, and there things are much more fluid, and you have no protection of form because there's no rigidity, everything is exposed just like that. And if you have strong emotions or desires, you have to struggle with them and struggle with the consequences of things being attracted to you by those desires and so on. Which is why the mother spoke of helping people across that passage. It can be quite disorienting, and it was one of her missions in this incarnation to create like a passage which is almost like a tunnel, in which your consciousness enters and slides straight out into the domain where your consciousness is free, bypassing these intermediate vital worlds where otherwise you can be quite disoriented and have to struggle. And she created a guardian being whose job it is to assist in this transition. And it's fascinating to see that across all cultures of the world, people have this experience in what they call near-death experience. It's as if a tunnel opens and then there's a being on the other side, being of light, who welcomes you and helps you make the transition. But that's how it works. In between, in the subtle physical, it's very similar to the physical domain. So you're dealing with form, so everything is very clear, dense but not rigid, semi-fluid.
That I wanted to know, the
Yes.
body form in the subtle physical.
Yes, yes.
Because you need to eat today.
And it is elastic.
You don't need to, actually the body doesn't need anything.
You don't need, but you can also enjoy. And the form being not rigid, it's elastic, so the hand can stretch out to reach and take.
Does it have the same time like our time, or is it different?
The sense of time is distinct in each of these, and as you go up, the time sense is also more fluid, faster or slower depending on your state of awareness. So you can be in the subtle domains for an hour there and come back and it's 5 minutes here, or you can be for 5 minutes there and you come back and it's an hour here. Because between the two there is no rigidity, there is more fluid.
Like if people went there for days and days,
Mhm.
what's their body doing in the meantime on Earth?
So you could be there for days but come back and only an hour has passed. Mhm. Very useful. You can get a lot of work done.
When you spoke about death, I'm sorry, I cannot speak about that. You said in the end you will be ready. What do you mean by ready? Ready, it means we are not, we don't have the fear of the death. Or ready, it means we finish our spiritual yoga on earth. What is the ready?
Okay. So the readiness here we used specifically in the sense of, are you tuned in to make that transition to a higher grade of consciousness and not struggle with lower pulls and pushes? So if you have organized your life around your spiritual aspiration, then you are ready, basically, because that's your primary focus. Then you can say, oh, if I have to shed my body now, it's okay, I'm already in tune with that. If you have not organized it around that focus, then you will say something like, oh well, but what about this, what about that, I need to tie up this, who will look after? All those things are still pulling you as your priorities, not this alignment with your inner aspiration. So this discussion was specifically around that question of what kind of state do you need to be so that in the transition after death you can enter the highest grade of your consciousness and remain in that domain. That was the main object of this discussion. But we can also take the question of, are you ready to die or shed the body? You don't die, you never die. We should never use the vocabulary, I died or you will die. Nobody dies. You shed the body, that's all. So are you ready to shed the body? And it's a question one can ask oneself. It's not an easy question to face.
What does it mean?
Yes,
For me, for example, personally, I never feel the
yes, exactly.
If it happens, okay.
Yes.
Never. But if you ask me if I am ready, I am not ready. I have a lot of spiritual work.
Exactly.
I'm not ready for
Exactly.
this aspect.
Yes. So there is this question of whether you're ready in terms of fear. Yes, you are clear of that. But I'm not ready to leave now because I have work to do. which is fine. And I would rather it was that case, because we need to do a lot of work. But nevertheless, if a situation was given where, sorry, you don't have a choice, you say, okay, then I need to get back and continue my work after. And that's fine. That's good enough. We should want to extend a healthy life as far as possible, so that we can do as much as possible in this opportunity that is given to us. And this should be one of our intended objectives, not out of fear, not out of some greed or attachment or desire, but simply for the opportunity that is given. Because it took us a long time to get to this poise where we are today, in terms of the overall orientation of our aspiration, integration of our personality, and the awakening of so many things in us. And it would be a pity if you have to drop it and restart and lose so much time again. So the time before us is extremely precious. And it is useful to go through that, what I described earlier as little deaths. Let your past go. Die to it. None of that matters. Whatever may have happened, however painful or difficult. It's sad when I hear people say, oh, I can never forgive this, or I can never forget that. Oh, come on. That's the baggage that's holding you from going forward. It's gone. It's over. You have to literally die to all your past and be reborn at each moment, because this is what is before us that we have to work for. And we should consciously seek to do that and to extend as far as we can in this lifetime the work that can be done. And for that we have been given all the help. The Mother herself has given us the example of how to take it as far as you can even. And the help is given to you in a way that at each moment we can make some significant progress. And that should be our objective.
Mother said recently, I listened CD of the Mother, and Mother said, when you are not master of life and death, you don't know anything.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yes. So at the very least, at each day, at the end of the day, we should be able to look back and feel that we have grown a little bit. Whatever the reference of growth, whether in terms of external skills, or in deeper communion and closeness with the presence, or in the integration of the inner and the outer, whatever form it takes. But we should feel distinctly every day one more step. Otherwise it's a wasted day. We'll continue this Friday after next.